In this video, I want to talk about the languages of early Buddhism. By early Buddhisms, I mean the Buddhist teachings that were transmitted in Indian languages that had not yet been translated into Tibetan or Chinese. There are many languages associated with early Buddhism, but there are three that you should bear in mind in particular. They are Magadhi Prakrit. It is a language used by Buddha to give his teaching. And there is Pali language, which is the language of the Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka. The only complete Buddhist canon of early Buddhism that survived to our days was written in the Pali language. And then there is the more well-known Sanskrit. Even though Sanskrit is the most well-known of the three languages, Buddhists actually did not start using Sanskrit until many centuries after Buddha's death, and it was associated with the so-called Mahayana movement, which I'll talk about. So in this video, I will elaborate on each of the three languages, but before doing that, I want to establish a linguistic relationship of the three languages. For example, what is Prakrit and how is it related to Sanskrit, and what's the relationship between Pali and Sanskrit. To start, all three languages are the so-called indo-aryan languages, which were spoken in the northern and central India and the surrounding areas. In turn, the indo-aryan languages make up the Indo-European languages. In this sense, Sanskrit is actually distantly related to English and other European languages. Scholars divide the Indo-Aryan languages into three stages of development: the early Indo-Aryan, the middle Indo-Aryan, and the late Indo-Aryan languages. For the early Indo-Aryan languages, the oldest of which is the so-called Vedic Sanskrit. It was in Vedic Sanskrit that were orally composed some of the world's oldest religious texts. I'm talking about the Vedas literature, which make up the spiritual core of Hinduism. They were orally composed sometime between the 1500 to the 900 BCE. But at this stage, the Sanskrit was still heterogeneous and unstructured, lacking a coherent grammar. As for a more homogeneous and structured kind of Sanskrit, it will come to be known as the classical Sanskrit. And so much time had passed since the Vedic Sanskrit that the two forms of Sanskrit became mutually incomprehensible. The classical Sanskrit was formalized by Panini, who wrote a grammar on the Sanskrit, who wrote a treatise on Sanskrit grammar. Panini lived sometimes between the 4th and the 6th century BCE, which is contemporaneous with Buddha. In other words, by the time of Buddha, the classical Sanskrit had already emerged. But while classical Sanskrit is the elitist language used by the social elites, the Brahmins, the majority of the population speak one or several of the Prakrit languages. Prakrit languages is a group of languages of the Middle Indo-Aryan languages. They include the two languages that we will talk about today, the Magadhi Prakrit and Pali. As for the late Indo-Aryan languages, they include the modern languages spoken by more than 900 million speakers today. The languages include Hindi, Urdu, and Nepali. But let's spend more time looking at the Middle Indo-Aryan period, because this is the period of Buddha Shakyamuni and of the centuries following his death. The word Sanskrit means refined, constructed. As the name implies, it is the language used by the higher social classes. The word Prakrit in turn means natural. It is the language spoken by the majority of the population. Buddhists commonly believe that Buddha even forbade his teaching be translated into Sanskrit, fearing that his teaching, if it were translated into Sanskrit, would become less accessible to the people. But whether this belief was textually supported, there are some debates, and you are welcome to do a little bit more reading. But in any case, it is the Prakrit languages that were the most popularly spoken languages, and there are many of them. But we will focus on just one, the Magadhi Prakrit. The Magadhi Prakrit is the language of the Magadha kingdom in the northeast India. It is here where Buddha spent a lot of time teaching. However, Buddha didn't grow up in Magadha. He grew up in Kapilavastu, where his family clan, the Shakya clan, was based in. He grew up here until he was 29, so his first language is probably the language here, which is likely not an Indo-European language. Neither did Buddha die in Magadha. Buddha died in Kushinara. And besides, Buddha spent a lot of time teaching in other cities like Vaishali, Varanasi, Koshala, Shravasti. So apparently, Buddha spoke more than one language, as it is often the case for the people living in the past. There are many theories as to what languages Buddha spoke, and you are welcome to do a little bit more digging. After Buddha's death, his most accomplished disciples gathered in Magadha and held the first Buddhist Council. In this council, two disciples, Ananda and Upali, recited by heart all of Buddha's teachings, thereby establishing the prototype of the Buddhist canon. Thereafter, Buddha's teachings will spread all over the Indian subcontinent, even to Central Asia, and even further. As Buddha's teachings reached to a new place, it was naturally orally translated into the local language. Besides, as the Buddhism grew, it splintered into different sects, and the different sects adopt a language depending on where they are. The one sect that we will be looking at and its language is the Theravada Buddhism and its Pali canon. This is an important language because it is in Pali that we have the only complete Buddhist canon of the early Buddhism. It's the only one that survived. And it is still Theravada Buddhism is still a living tradition that is being practiced in Southeast Asia and even in the West, thanks to the modern Vipassana meditation movement. According to the traditions, Buddha's teaching reached Sri Lanka sometime in the 3rd century BCE, but at this stage, the Buddha's teachings was only orally translated. You had to wait until the 1st century BCE before the Buddha's teachings were written down. And it's believed that this is the first time after Buddha's death that his teachings was written down, at least according to the tradition. But linguistically speaking, what is Pali? The Theravada commentator Buddhaghosa equated Pali with Magadhi. That's another way of saying that Buddha spoke Pali. But with the hindsight of the modern scholars, we know that Pali is a mixture of several Prakrit languages that emerged around the 3rd century BCE, which became Sanskritized. So thus far, we have talked about two Prakrit languages, the Magadhi Prakrit and Pali. Now let's look at the Sanskrit. We already talked about the Sanskrit, but I was saying that the Buddhists didn't use Sanskrit for the early period. It was not until the few centuries after the Common Era that Sanskrit became a Buddhist language. It is true that in the early period, Sanskrit was rarely used by the political regimes unless spoken by the people. In the study of the inscriptions of this period, Professor Bronkhorst observed that many inscriptions from the time of Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE to the early centuries of the Common Era were rarely written in Sanskrit, but in other Indo-Aryan languages. But there came a time when Sanskrit became important and became the lingua franca of this part of Asia. For almost a millennium, Sanskrit will dominate the international trade and the intercultural exchange. And in this period in which Sanskrit was the dominant language, will come to be called the Sanskrit Cosmopolis. It is the term coined by the Professor Sheldon Pollock. So the Buddhist adoption of Sanskrit could very much be understood in this larger context in which the Sanskrit became the lingua franca of this part of Asia. Now let's look at some of the earliest cases in which Buddhists adopted Sanskrit. One of the most famous cases is the Theravada school in the northeast India, especially in Kashmir. It will later spread to Central Asia. And many texts that will later be transmitted into East Asia were also the Sadhistivada text written in Sanskrit. As for the reasons why Sadhistivada adopted Sanskrit, the French scholar Vincent Alchinger, he proposed this novel hypothesis that perhaps Sanskrit possesses more intimate relationship with reality, or perhaps because in order to defend Buddhism in regard to non-Buddhists, it is necessary to speak the language spoken by the non-Buddhists, which was Sanskrit at the time. But the most important reason underpinning the rising importance of Sanskrit was the Mahayana text. Few centuries after Buddha's death, there emerged a new type of Buddhist text that was very different from the previous ones. This type of text was more interested in the metaphysical questions such as the emptiness, and it promoted the ideal of bodhisattva, someone who aspired to Buddhahood for the sake of all sentient beings. Mahayana and its origin, this is a complex topic which I will make another video about. For now, it suffices to know that the Mahayana Buddhism emerged a few centuries after Buddha's death and will become so influential in East Asia that the Buddhism practiced in East Asia will come to be called the Mahayana Buddhism. And Sanskrit, being the vehicular language of Mahayana Buddhism, will also come to play an important part in East Asian Buddhism. A caveat here is that many Mahayana texts, even though not all, were written in a language that mixed Prakrit with Sanskrit. Scholar Franklin Edgerton will call this language the Buddha's hybrid Sanskrit. Lastly, later on, many important Mahayana commentators, such as Nagarjuna Vasubandhu, will also write in Sanskrit. So all these reasons contributed to Sanskrit gradually becoming a very important language in the East Asian Buddhism. So in summary, in this video we'll talk about three languages: the Magadhi Prakrit, which is one among several languages spoken by Buddha, especially when he taught in Magadha Kingdom, and Pali language is the language of the Theravada Buddhism in Sri Lanka. The only complete early Buddhist canon that we have was written in Pali. And the Sanskrit, we look at several forms of Sanskrit: the Vedic Sanskrit, the classical Sanskrit. Classical Sanskrit will be used in the early centuries of Common Era by Sarvastivada to write the early Buddhist teachings, and more importantly, it will be used in the Mahayana texts.